this morning I have a couple things. I'm going to talk a little bit about fly control and a little bit about using auto feeders with our goats. Good morning. I am starting my live Q&A session this morning. My name is Leslie Sacchina and I farm in western Wisconsin. I raise meat goats and a few sheep on pasture along with some guardian dogs. My farm is Silon Rolling Acres, and I started doing hey, good morning. This live Q&A just as a way to share more information about raising goats and how we do things. I get lots of questions, and I know that if you have got questions, others probably have the same ones. And in my journey in raising goats, I've learned a lot along the way because there's really not a lot of resources out there. So this is kind of the premise or background of these live Q&As. I'll always have, if you don't catch them or you can only watch a little bit of it in your morning. Good morning, Paul. If you only catch a little bit of it, know that I will have it archived here on Instagram, but I'm also recording it. So I'll have it shown on my blog, and I'll also reference related resources and things like that, just as a point of reference. So this morning I have a couple things. I'm going to talk a little bit about fly control and a little bit about using auto feeders with our goats. And so those are the two focuses of the questions today. So I'll jump into the fly control one because for us this is fairly minimal or pretty kind of a small topic to cover for us. So if you followed us or take a look on social media or on our blog, you'll know that we really take a holistic approach to how we're raising our goats and our livestock. So we're using rotational grazing practices. We're moving our animals every 1 to 2 days on pasture. And it doesn't mean that we won't address health issues when they come up with traditional medicine practices, but I really like to take a preventative approach in using and try to work alongside nature with and take nature's cues on how we manage our herd and manage our farm. And so that's just what's worked for us. And again, it's kind of that mix. So when it comes to fly control, I found that for us, we really haven't had to do a lot to manage flies. And so this is when, again, as I talk about the context of how we manage our goats, I believe it's because our goats aren't staying in one place for very long. So every time we move them to a new paddock, their water tank is being moved. So that's in a new location, which tends to be where flies will attract. And then sometimes it seems like there's like a couple of weeks within the summer that maybe they're a little bit more intense, but beyond that, it really doesn't seem to be an issue. I will say for our livestock guardian dogs, flies tend to be more of a challenge for them. So that's something I'm always kind of thinking about. How can I make the issue of flies less of a challenge for them? So that's kind of an ongoing process. And then I will say, though, just kind of in converse, and I'm not saying one way is the right way or wrong way, but I have noticed when we do keep a group of goats in the barn in the summertime, whether it's bottle babies that are being finished and kind of working on getting them a group transition so they can join the rest on pasture, or an animal that we might be managing, keeping in the barn to monitor other health challenges, just because it's easier to work with an animal who's in a pen who has maybe in recovery mode versus out on pasture. I will say that flies will be more of an issue when they're in the barn, or maybe in the barn and have access to a run outside. So I understand that can be a challenge. Some things, I've talked with some other folks who are raising animals similar to us, and they kind of see the similar challenges. So one thing, others have seen that you don't always know when it comes sometimes with research, but potentially garlic, if you mix it in your mineral, possibly could be of a deterrent for flies as a natural holistic approach. And of course, there are other insecticides that you can use as well, but that's not an approach that we take, just because I feel that our management system helps minimize any flies that are available. And really, if there are some, a lot of times the goats are moving their ears and their tails, and they kind of move most of them away in the times when they are around. All right, so second topic I'm going to jump into is related to bottle baby raising. So We do have an auto feeder that we use. It's called the Lac Tek. It's by a company called Biotic. And I would say we probably wouldn't have it in our operation or our farming operation, and how we run things now. Maybe I guess I probably would, maybe, but I wouldn't necessarily have the large scale version of it. But we, several years ago, when we were getting started raising our meat goat herd, we also were raising bottle baby dairy buck kids. So in Wisconsin, we have a very strong and robust dairy goat industry. And much like if you think about dairy cow world, the males, the bucklings for the goats are raised for meat. And so I think it's great if we can find a solution and a use for those animals, because obviously they can't make milk because they're not females. So we, for quite some time while we were building our meat goat breed herd, which our herd is Boer Kiko Cross, we were also raising dairy buck kids as a form of meat. So we kind of had two different models going on. And part of our process, we bottle fed with bucket feeders. And then eventually we invested into this auto feeder called a Lac Tek 2. You can get them from Premier, or direct from the manufacturer, and also from Premier 1, which is a sheep and goats. They predominantly a sheep and goat supplier. They sell other stuff for some other species. That's their main focus. But we use the auto feeder, and I would say like for auto feeder, so I had a question about the auto feeder in general. So, the question, I guess I'll jump back to the question just so, actually I don't have it written down here, but the question was really the pros and cons of using this auto feeder that we have. And so when I looked at what was on the market, there's really two auto feeders on the market designed for goats. It was the Lac Tek 2, and then there was a really high-end one that was probably about triple to quadruple the cost. And so the cost alone, based on doing a little bit of research on this feeder, put me in the direction of raising or utilizing the Lac Tek 2 for us. And part of it is because we're not, if I were a goat dairy, maybe I might look at it a little bit differently. Or if I was solely raising just dairy buck kids, maybe I might look at that other feeder as a long-term investment. But for us, this is what made sense for us. So from a pro standpoint, I really, cost-wise, it was really the way to go for options. And so from there, I'll just talk a little bit about the pros and cons on the machine that we're using. And what I'll do is afterwards, I will link to a couple other videos that I've made about the Lac Tek feeder, so you can take a look at how it works and kind of get an idea of that. But they do come in different sizes where you can feed just a handful. The capacity is for a handful of animals to up to I think it was over 150 animals on one machine. So the one that we used, we purchased the largest one. And so at the time before we decided to get out of raising bottle baby bucklings for meat purposes, we were raising about 100 a year. So we wanted to make sure we had enough capacity to continue bringing in animals and moving them through that cycle. And I'll also say too, I knew there were, as I was looking at options, there were a number of other goat dairy farms in our area that were using them, and I did some other research talking with other goat dairy farmers in Wisconsin online on those who were using them and figuring out was this a wise investment, and so forth. And overall, people are happy with them. Like anything, there's issues. There can be little tweaks and things like that. But getting to the pros, so for us, once a young animal was trained to the feeder, and so we would get animals. Bucklings in about at a day, anywhere between 1 day, I'd say probably 2 days old to a week. If they were trained well to a bottle, their transition was pretty quick. Otherwise, sometimes the really young ones, I had to do a little bit of work with them to get trained in understanding how to use the nipple outlet. But once they were able to use it, it worked great. So they knew they just ate on demand, kind of like if they were dam raised. So I'd really compare it to more the idea of being dam raised goats versus bottle babies where you're feeding with bottles, whether it's 4 times a day, 2 times a day, whatever that frequency might be. So they were less if you ever raise bottle babies, you know that even though they're very friendly, sometimes they can be a little overwhelming at feeding time. So I really enjoyed having goats that were calmer at feeding time because they were eating when they wanted to and when they needed to, and they weren't rushing me for feed or overeating maybe because they were ready to eat at a certain time. So that really helped. Also stress wise on them as well. And when I was working, and also it gave me more time to when I would come in and do cleanings on the machine or we clean their pen, I could actually, or do other work in the barn, I actually could take the time to do more observation of how their behavior was or if there's any health concerns. So I felt like I had a better excuse me, jumping on my words, a better handle on my animals' health and their behavior because that layer of like just in time feeding wasn't happening. They grew a lot, I would say, compared to other bottle babies that were hand fed. They grew a lot faster, and I say hand fed is in same comparison with like using a bucket feeder and things like that. I felt like they grew a lot faster on the auto feeder because they could eat when they felt like they could, and overeating really wasn't an issue for us. And I would say too, I'm just looking at my notes because I didn't want to miss anything. You know, we were looking at resources on using these auto feeders, Pipestone Vet Clinic out of Minnesota, it had a number of resources and did some webinars on utilizing or how to use these auto feeders with sheep and goats and best practices. And so it was really interesting is when I did the training, they talked about you could wean at 30 days, which is, I was like, yeah, right. Like, I mean, it's not a selling point, but I was like, I mean, I wouldn't say this is the reason to bottle feed, but I was really like, I was kind of apprehensive. I'm like, I'm not sure if that will really work. But as we got into raising them, I realized pretty quickly that many of the goats, every situation's different, but many of them that were on the auto feeder could be weaned at 30 days if you started working on transitioning them to hay and grain to kind of aid with that transition off the auto feeder. So I will say that if you're looking at auto feeder options, there is that benefit of versus bottle feeding to be able to wean them off of milk replacer earlier as compared to if you were hand feeding. Of course, if they're smaller animals, sometimes I would let them stay on there longer. In terms of like managing the equipment and setup is a little bit complicated to set up, but not horribly. The instructions weren't super clear on calibrating, but I think if you kind of walk through it, you can, or find somebody who's used it, they can give you some tips. And then also, I found a few times when I've had some issues with it, I've called into the company itself, and they were able to help me address some of the issues I had. So I guess the support that they have to offer from their tech staff was very helpful. I would recommend having extra equipment or extra parts on hand because when you're in the thick of bottle feeding, you're probably not going to want to wait for extra equipment or parts. We didn't really run through a lot of parts, but they do have an extra parts kit. So those are some things that you may want to consider. So some of the cons for us, even though I talked about this as being more of an economical option, it still is a pretty expensive upfront cost when you compare it to using a bottle feeding system or hand bottle feeding, or even using a bucket system. But then again, so is your time. So I'm not in there. When I'm using the auto feeder, and we still use it now for feeding any bottle babies. For us, it's technically we're just using it on a small scale with if we have any triplets or quads, or if a new mom or something happens with the babies. Typically, it's usually if it's triplets or quads. But if there are other issues, we'll put them on the auto feeder. We also have been raising bottle babies for one of my friends' herds. He has Boer goats as well too. So if he has triplets or quads, he doesn't have time to bottle feed them, which I don't blame him. So I will add them to my group of bottle babies. But there is an upfront cost of investing in the machine. There is a smaller version. So if you're just looking for something to use with a handful of goats, or sheep too, or lambs, you could look at the smaller version, and I think it would be very doable. For us, it's now where it's like maybe 10 to 15 goats we're raising versus 100, but we already have money invested in the machine, so we're keeping it as part of one of our tools. The cost of milk replacer, obviously, but if you're in the situation where you're raising bottle babies, it just comes as part of the work. And then also, if you're in a cold climate, it depends on when you're raising the goats for that matter, but we are in Wisconsin, and we are, when we were raising bottle babies, most of the time when we got them, it was sometime between January and March, and that is still a very, well, it is the coldest time of the year in Wisconsin. Even into March, it can be colder, so we had to be concerned about keeping the machine from freezing. And so while there's a heater built into the machine to have hot milk or hot water to mix the milk replacer, you do have to be concerned about not having the lines freeze or have the whole machine out in an area. So we built a room where our auto feeder, either you have to have a climate controlled barn, or we built a small building that we put in like a wall propane heater and just kept that room at just a low ambient temp to make sure there weren't any freezing issues. But that is a reality of being in northern climates. You should be cleaning daily. It's not always the most exciting thing to be doing, but I remind myself I'm not cleaning bottles, and the goats aren't swarming me while I'm feeding, so that is just, part of the process of feeding milk replacer to any livestock. The other thing I found too is sometimes the tubes from the feeder to the feeding outlets sometimes will fall off, so we've had to do a little bit of rigging on the back end to prevent that from happening, so we don't have milk replacer spill in my warm, in the insulated building. But those are little things that you can set up for prevention. But I would say, overall, it's been a great investment. We continue to use it. We probably could use a smaller scale now, but it's what we have. A few things that I would give advice if you're looking at using them. Some things that I looked at as well too is I looked at best practices for using them and in terms of feeding and cleaning and maintenance. I looked at what dairy farms were using with their auto feeders, because auto feeders for calves are pretty common, and so I was able to get a good process of and some good advice on how to clean it more effective than just maybe using hot soapy water, and just that process of using the equipment, since there's less folks using them in the goat world. I talked about Pipestone Vet Clinic. They had their Shepherds webinar resources. I know they've had some changes in how in their education tools with the passing of their main veterinarian, but you still might find some resources out there. For us, we did pens of 10 per outlet, and that seemed to work well for not having too much competition. And I believe that was something that we kind of took from, I believe, Pipestone, but then also looking at the recommendations based on the capacity of the auto feeder. And so that, again, not crowding, and it was easier to keep those pens clean, and so forth. And again, with maintenance in the pen, because they're just drinking liquid, you need to make sure you're really working to keep those pens clean. So we were feeding or adding more, or cleaning the pens, and also adding more bed pack. Also, of course, just like any young animal, you want to watch for scouring and pneumonia, especially for us when we were, the time we're raising them is during that springtime weather. And because I just found in general, comparing bottle babies to our dam raised babies, the bottle babies just take a little bit more maintenance and watching, tend to be a little bit more conducive to health challenges or risks, just because there's that little bit of stress and probably from not being dam raised. Again, not saying one way is wrong or right, but they just tended to be a little bit, have more challenges, and you need to kind of keep on top of them a little bit more. Let's see here. And so now I'll just touch a little bit because on this too, since it's related. So for us, we developed, after about 3 years of using it, we developed a pretty good system of using the auto feeder and then building those animals in to our management system of rotational grazing. But what worked for us, just because though it would typically the bottle babies at that time when we were raising were dairy breeds, we found that for that group of goats, we were when we started to wean them, they would get hay and some grain, and then once we transitioned them onto pasture, they were pasture only. Just because at the time when our pasture was the best quality, and then in the fall, that group we would supplement some grain with their pasture, just because their rate of gain and the way that they put on muscle is different than our meat breeds. And so that system worked well for us. So that was more of a pasture raised model than just strictly grass fed. And so I think, for us, we just found at the time when we decided to get out of it, our other herd was growing. We had a second child who came into the world with some health challenges. Nothing major. She's good now, but, it just took more time on us that we decided that we were going to focus on our meat herd versus raising dairy buck kids, just because it was more time intensive, even with the auto feeder. And then we were also able to focus more on raising animals in the grass-based environment that we had been working, again, less time intensive from a feeding perspective, less inputs, less, the goats did most of the work than we had to monitor. But I really think, if there is a lot of opportunity potential for raising dairy buck kids for meat. I think it's just a matter of figuring out a system where it's, time effective, managing your input costs, and finding the right market where you sell them. It's kind of the right combination. But I do think there's opportunity there. And if you haven't heard or followed of James Wetler in the UK, he has a business called Cabrito, and he actually, all the goat meat he sells through his business comes from dairy goats in the UK area. As he's kind of built a solution, a model around providing goat meat, but also the opportunity of having this other availability of male goats from these dairy farms. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. You just need to figure out from a production standpoint what makes the best sense with time and cost and all those factors. So that's what I have for today. I will, like every week I will do is I will get this video. It'll be available for archive here on Instagram, but I will also upload a version of it in YouTube. So it may be a little bit more friendly to watch. It'll be included in my blog with notes related to what I talk about. What I talked about today. So if you have any questions, just comment below. Otherwise, I have a question form that I'll include in my show notes on the blog or YouTube, and I can follow up on some of those things in the future. So have a good Wednesday.